Okay, so a little different venue for today's lecture recording. Um, my car was in the shop this morning, so I didn't drive to campus, so I'm home. I usually record videos in my home office, but my daughter just moved back in with us temporarily, so she is living in my office now, and I'm recording this in my living room on the sofa. So um, the topic for today, I debated a little bit over what to talk about today, but since we're on the topic of extraterrestrial life, there's a lecture I used to give in my astrobiology class about the question of what kinds of environments are suitable for life, and the fact that we tend to bias our answer to that question in our heads based on what kind of environments are suitable for human life and also for life of common things like trees and flowers and birds and squirrels and the things we see around us. There are environments on Earth that we would normally consider inhospitable to life. That if we found a planet with a average climate that was similar to some of these Earth environments, we would probably dub that location to be incompatible with life. So we want to talk a little bit about the extreme environments on Earth where we find life, and maybe that will shed some light on the possibility that we might need to broaden our definition of what counts as a suitable environment for life. The first thing we want to look at is extreme heat. We normally think of the kind of average surface temperature, atmospheric temperature of the Earth, say between 30 degrees Fahrenheit and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, as being most hospitable for life, for animal and plant life. But there are microbes on the Earth that can withstand much higher heat than this. This is a pool near a geyser at Yellowstone, and the yellow coloration comes from, it's called Grand Prismatic Spring, bacteria that live in this water, and the byproducts of those bacteria cause that color. The temperature of the water in the spring is 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So there are organisms on our planet that can withstand heats up to 160 degrees. The cat is scratching something right now. I gotta throw something at him. Percy, stop it. Um, which means that when we look at a planet like Mercury, where planets on the border between the light side and the dark side might be around 160 degrees, we might be able to say, well, 160 degrees isn't great for most Earth life, but it's possible that some organisms can live in temperatures that extreme. At the bottom of our oceans, there are organisms that live in and around seafloor vents where the water temperature can reach 400 degrees Celsius. That's more than 700 degrees Fahrenheit. And you might say, isn't that above the boiling point of water? Remember, the boiling point of water depends on pressure, and the pressure at the bottom of the ocean is much, much higher than the pressure at sea level. So there are organisms that live in and around these seafloor vents in temperatures that are far in excess of what normal plants and animals on the Earth can withstand. The pressure at a seafloor vent can exceed 400 atmospheres. So you're getting pretty close. I mean, 400 atmospheres of pressure and temperatures of 700 degrees Fahrenheit, you're getting pretty close to the situation on Venus. So we can imagine a terrestrial planet with temperatures and pressures that are much higher than the temperatures and pressures on Earth, especially in the water, where microbial life might be able to not only survive, but thrive. These are what's called tube worms living in and around one of these vents. And the interesting thing about hydrothermal vents, and I think I mentioned this once when we were talking about Europa and the possibility of sea life at the bottom of Europa's ocean, if it does have one under the ice, is that there are entire ecosystems of organisms in and around these sea vents that have a life cycle and an energy cycle that does not depend on photosynthesis at all. Here on the surface, most of the energy in our ecosystem comes from plants that feed on sunlight, and then animals eat the plants, and then other animals eat those animals, and the whole life cycle is fed by light. At the bottom of the ocean, there are ecosystems where it's heat and chemical energy that feed the bottom of the ecosystem, that bacteria metabolize heat and other organisms um, consume the waste products of those bacteria or the organisms themselves. And there's a whole cycle of energy that does not involve sunlight at all. Something similar to this is possible to imagine under the ice of the moon of some Jovian planet, where the internal heat of that moon comes from tidal heating, and seafloor vents feed that heat into the ocean. A typical chemical reaction has carbon and dioxide and hydrogen sulfide combining together to release sulfur compounds in water. So completely different chemical process than happens in photosynthesis. Here again, another picture of these tube worms that live in these kind of calcite shells. And this yellow color is from the sulfur. That's the waste product of this chemical reaction that is, for them, the version of what we on the surface would do is respiration, combining something with oxygen, usually sugars like glucose with oxygen, and then releasing energy. These organisms are combining sulfur compounds, hydrogen sulfide, with oxygen and releasing energy that way. These sorts of metabolisms, these chemosynthetic rather than photosynthetic processes, and metabolisms based on hydrogen and sulfur instead of, say, carbon dioxide and sugars, may have been the kinds of metabolisms that the first living things on Earth had. In other words, the first living things on Earth might not have been like algae that live on the surface of the Earth now, but may have been much more like these deep sea organisms that are feeding off heat at the bottom of the ocean. And alien life forms that we find on other planets may have a similar origin. This is just a diagram showing a typical cycle of chemical processes from methanogenic organisms that release methane that's then metabolized along with hydrogen sulfide by bacteria. And there's a whole cycle of chemical and energy byproducts that's similar to the kind of plants to animals cycle of energy at the surface, but doesn't have anything to do with sunlight at all. There have been some organisms on Earth, some bacteria that have been discovered that can survive extreme temperatures higher than the boiling point of water. There's a bacteria called strain 121, named after the temperature that it can survive, which is 121 degrees Celsius. Before strain 121 was discovered, we assumed that just boiling water that had bacteria in it was enough to kill most bacteria, that most bacteria will be killed at 100 degrees Celsius. Strain 121 proves us wrong. It can actually survive quite a bit higher temperatures than that, higher than most surface-dwelling bacteria that we find on the Earth. Can we imagine someplace even hotter having life living in it? Someplace as hot as Venus, which is 900 degrees Fahrenheit. It turns out that it's difficult to imagine living organisms existing at a temperature much higher than about 150 degrees Celsius. And the reason for that is big organic molecules, which you need to have any kind of complicated life, tend to fall apart at those high temperatures. So 300 Fahrenheit, sustained temperatures of 300 Fahrenheit are probably around the max that we can imagine any kind of living organism surviving. So Venus is probably out, but a planet that's somewhere, if there was, say, a planet dropped into our solar system 4 billion years ago between Venus and Earth that had a surface temperature of 240 degrees Fahrenheit, we might imagine life being able to survive on the planet. We call organisms that are capable of surviving in extreme environments extremophiles. And there are all sorts of different extremophiles depending on the thing that they can tolerate extreme amounts of. So thermophiles can withstand extreme amounts of heat. Heats up to, say, 115 degrees or higher Fahrenheit. Um, Something like strain 121, we might call a hyperthermophile that can withstand temperatures of greater than 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Um, Barophiles, think of a barometer which measures pressure, or piezophiles, can withstand high pressures, pressures of 300, 400, all the way up to 1,000 atmospheres worth of pressure. Um, Acidophiles can withstand extremely acidic environments with a pH below 2.0. Neutral water has a pH of 7. Um, Higher pHs than that are bases, lower pHs than that are um, acids. So a pH of 2.0 would be like the hydrochloric acid you might use in a chemistry lab, not pure, but diluted hydrochloric acid. There are also organisms that can withstand extreme cold. In fact, 75% of the Earth's biosphere, if you count Antarctica, if you count high mountaintops, and if you count the deep ocean, 75% of the biosphere on Earth is colder than 5 degrees Celsius. So you might say that the bulk of organisms or environments on Earth that are accessible to living organisms have what we would think of as extreme cold temperatures that are close to the freezing point of water, if not below. There are bacteria that can grow at temperatures below the freezing point of water, as cold as 10 degrees Fahrenheit or 12 degrees below 0 Celsius, which is remarkable when you think of the fact that living organisms usually require liquid in order for their parts to move around. This bacterium, Psychromonas ingrami, can grow at temperatures that are as cold as temperatures that are often found on Mars, 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Organisms that can withstand extreme cold are called psychrophiles, Psychro. Greek root word for cold. There are other situations on Earth. Excuse me, I took my allergy medicine today, but I'm still coughing on it. One extreme environment on Earth where most life would find inhospitable is environments where there's a lot of salt in the water. For example, there's a whole body of water called the Dead Sea, which is called the Dead Sea because very little lives in it because of the extreme salinity of the water. The Dead Sea has a salinity of 33%, which is 8 times the amount of salt found in ocean water, which you've probably all had the experience of accidentally getting a little bit in our mouth, so we know how salty ocean water is. Imagine 8 times that much salt in the water. That is extremely unfriendly to most large living organisms like fish, which is why the Dead Sea doesn't have a whole lot living in it. It's called the Dead Sea. Nevertheless, there are organisms that can live in this extremely salty environment. Certain types of bacteria, which are called halophiles, halite for salt, are able to withstand and tolerate and live and thrive and survive in environments that have extremely high concentrations of sodium chloride, which tends to cause nutrients to flow out of things and to dry them out. If you fully saturate water with salt, the maximum amount of salt, it will take into solution. The freezing point drops to about 21 degrees below 0 Celsius, about -6 Fahrenheit. We can therefore imagine planets with salty oceans that are colder than our oceans, that are below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. A situation similar to this might exist on planets like Europa and Ganymede and Titan, where there are subsurface oceans that are not only very, very cold, but very, very salty. And the fact that we have organisms on Earth that can tolerate very, very cold and very, very salty environments suggests that environments like this might not be completely inhospitable to life. There's also the problem of extremely dry environments. Most living things require their nutrients and their um, cells to be in a liquid solution. And so most living organisms need to be constantly supplied with water. Organisms that are extremely tolerant of small amounts of water or living in very dry environments are called xerophiles, zero with an X. And there are organisms on Earth that can tolerate extremely um, dry environments. So here's most, so this A sub W is basically a measure of how wet something is. So water has a value of 1. Dried fruit has a value of 0.5. The reason dried fruit is a thing, and the reason you don't have to put dried fruit in the refrigerator, right? Like raisins or like the kind of dried apricots and stuff you put in trail mix, is because with all the water taken out of the fruit, bacteria can't live in there. You see that most of these bacteria, their growth is inhibited at a dryness level of, say, 0.95 is enough for E. coli. 0.92 is enough for Listeria. 0.86 is enough for Staphylococcus. You've probably heard of all these bacteria as things that make you sick, right? So drying something out is one way to inhibit bacteria growth. Things like cured meats, like bacon, are dried and salted in order to inhibit bacterial growth. Excuse me again. There are, however, bacteria that can live in a saturated salt solution, and even being in an extremely dried out environment won't kill them. There are even macroscopic organisms, such as the tardigrade, which is seen here in an electron microscope picture, that can withstand long periods of time of almost complete dryness, no water available whatsoever. And the organism kind of goes into a stasis, where its metabolic processes just shut down. And then the next time it's exposed to water, the organism comes out of that stasis. There are also organisms that are able to tolerate radioactivity, which would be harmful or deadly to most macroscopic organisms like, say, humans. This bacteria called Deinococcus radiodurans has been found to be able to tolerate many times more radiation than would kill most living organisms. One of the units of X-ray exposure is called the gray, G-R-E-Y or G-R-A-Y. Amount of radiation that is immediately deadly is about 10 grays. 1 gray is enough to probably give you radiation poisoning or even long-term cause cancer. A typical X-ray, when you go to the doctor, you break your arm or whatever and go and get an X-ray, has an amount of radioactivity equal to 1/200th of a gray, 0.005 gray, which is enough to be deemed safe. You can get several X-rays over the course of your life, and they're not generally harmful to you. You will notice when you get an X-ray that the person giving you the X-ray, however, leaves the room while you're getting the X-ray. They walk around the corner usually, or behind a wall. The reason for that is that technician giving you the X-ray might do 100 X-rays a day, which means rather than just being exposed to those X-rays once every few years, like a patient might be, they're exposed to thousands of times that exposure over the course of a year. So they leave the room to protect themselves from the constant exposure. So 10 grays of radioactive exposure is enough to kill a human. It takes more than that to kill a bacteria. There are some places where we use radioactivity to sterilize things. Some food that you eat has had the bacteria killed by radioactivity. It takes more radioactivity to kill a bacterium than it does to kill a human, about 6 times as much to kill an E. coli bacterium. But the radiodurans bacteria can survive a dose of 5,000 grays with no damage whatsoever. So that's 500 times as much radioactivity, or 100 times as much radioactivity as a typical bacterium. And it can survive 15,000 grays, 3 times as much, and only lose 37% viable. In other words, only have its ability to reproduce reduced by about a third. So if you have a sample of 300 of them, about 100 will still be able to reproduce after being exposed to um, 1,500 times as much radiation as will kill a human. There's a really interesting question to ask about the existence of the radiodurans bacteria. First of all, how um, is it able to do this and not die? And I'm not a biologist, but the short answer, the short non-technical answer is it has methods of repairing its own genome. In other words, fixing defects in its own DNA that other organisms do not have, which enables it to essentially just repair the damage to its genome that's caused by radioactivity, which is why radioactivity kills things and gives things cancer, is it screws up the actual DNA of an organism. A better question is why? Why would an organism evolve to be able to tolerate huge amounts of radioactivity when huge amounts of radioactivity simply don't exist on the Earth? That's not how evolution works, right? Things evolve to become adapted to particular environments. Well, there's no environment on the Earth that has 15,000 times as much radioactivity as the surface. As best as we can understand it, radiodurans didn't evolve specifically to be able to survive radioactivity, but it evolved these gene repair mechanisms as a way to survive other kinds of extreme environments. And these gene repair mechanisms also happen to be super useful for repairing the damage caused by extreme radioactivity. Another place where we can find extremophiles is inside of rocks. One way to find an environment where you're protected from being eaten by things, and protected from ultraviolet light, and protected from weather, and protected by from changing environmental conditions, is to actually just live inside of rocks. This is a picture of a rock with a layer here of biological material inside the material of the stone. Organisms that live inside of rocks are called endoliths. And there's a lot we don't know about the organisms that live deep in the Earth's rocks, perhaps even to depths of several kilometers deep. Again, these are just microorganisms, but microorganisms are the most they're what we expect to find on extraterrestrial planets first. Remember, the Earth was nothing but microorganisms for 2 billion years. So the fact that microorganisms can live inside of rocks means that a planet like Mars, which we look at the surface and say, that surface isn't inhabited, might have, living inside of the rocks of Mars, endolithic microorganisms that have been living under that surface since the time when Mars was warmer and wetter and had a thicker atmosphere. So we have to keep this possibility in mind before we rule out the habitability of some place like Mars, that organisms are able to hide in parts of the biosphere that may remain hidden from just a cursory look at the surface. And all we've had so far is a cursory look at the surface of Mars. One of the reasons we want to send people to Mars, to dig down deep and to look further into the crust of the planet than we've been able to before, is to look for that hidden water that might be under the surface in the form of permafrost, and possible organisms that might be living in that rock. There are other kinds of extremophiles. Acidophiles that can tolerate acids, alkalophiles that can tolerate extremely basic chemical environment, metallo-tolerant bacteria and organisms that can survive exposure to things like cadmium and arsenic and mercury, oligotrophs, which are able to live in places where the amount of nutrients, the amount of organic carbon compounds available to it to metabolize, are present in very small concentrations, down to 1 part per million or less. And so the fact that these organisms exist, I already talked about tardigrades, prompts us to ask what relevance this has to the question of extraterrestrial life. And there's a couple of answers I can give to this. So what? So there are things on the earth that can live in really cold places or really hot places or really dry places. First of all, it expands our notion of what a habitable zone might be, to include places that are not friendly to normal earth plants and animals. It suggests that there might be organisms that can survive extinction events on a planet by living in these other extreme environments. For example, suppose Mars 2 billion years ago was covered in oceans, had a greenhouse effect that kept it warm, and had microorganisms living in all the oceans. Over time, whatever happened to Mars, the solar wind, well, the inside cooled, the magnetic field slowed down, the solar winds stripped away, the upper atmosphere broke down the water in the atmosphere, the greenhouse effect started to drop, the water all froze, the oceans dried up, killed most of the things that were living on the Martian surface. This is all hypothetical, by the way, but suppose this is what happened. It's possible that some of those organisms that had lived in Mars, on Mars, when its surface was more habitable, could have survived that extinction by going underground and living in the rocks, by living in the extremely cold polar ice caps, whatever. That some organisms could have evolved to cope with the much drier, much colder environment that we see on Mars today. So organisms could survive these extinctions by adapting to these extreme conditions. It also raises a question of the possibility of this idea called panspermia. Panspermia is this idea that organisms can be transferred from one planet to another. That, for example, a meteor could hit the Earth and blast a bunch of rocks out into space. And some of those rocks that float around in the Earth's orbit will eventually maybe fall into the clouds of Venus or be scooped up by the gravitational pull of Mars. Or the opposite, Mars could have been hit by an asteroid and some bits of Mars get knocked off, and some of those Mars meteorites eventually fall on Earth. We have found meteorites, chunks of rock that seem to be from Mars. They have the same surface, the same composition as Mars rocks. Suppose there's some kind of creature like a tardigrade that can survive extremely dry conditions, extremely cold conditions, and could just go into hibernation or dormancy or stasis on that space rock for 100 years until it winds up landing on another planet. Could life forms actually be spread from one planet to another by collisions, such that Earth microorganisms could have wound up on Mars billions of years ago, or Mars organisms could have wound up on Earth billions of years ago? I don't consider panspermia to be a very serious scientific idea. The probability of an organism, even a very sturdy microbe, surviving for the average amount of time it takes a meteor to find its way from being blasted off of Mars to landing on the Earth or vice versa, it's extremely unlikely. But there are serious scientists who still do talk about and ask questions about and write papers about panspermia, so it's something to think about. Could there be rocks floating around our solar system that were blasted off of Mars that might have some microorganisms still living on them that could be revived think there's some science fiction stories about that as well. Um, but we'll leave that for the science fiction authors for now. What this mostly does is it forces us to expand our notion of habitable zones to not just mean this narrow strip of our solar system where you might be able to have liquid water on the surface, but to also imagine habitable spots like beneath the surface of Mars's rocks, or at the bottom of the ocean of Europa's cold and salty oceans, or floating around in the cloud tops of Venus's hot and highly acidic atmosphere. We might be able to imagine planets that maintain their habitability long after their environment changes. If life managed to get a foothold on that planet when it was more habitable, we might imagine that life continuing to eke out some sort of existence in these habitable spots where they're able to withstand these extreme environments. It's worth noting that extremophiles on Earth probably all originally evolved in more habitable places, that nothing evolved originally, no life formed originally in a 160-degree hot spring. No organisms started out being able to tolerate the salinity of the Dead Sea. Organisms probably evolved in friendlier environments and then gradually adapted themselves around the edges of these extreme environments to be able to tolerate these extreme environments. The evolutionary advantage of that is if you're the only organism that is able to withstand this extreme environment, all of the biological resources of that environment belong to you. So if you might say, well, why would an organism evolve to be able to live in a 160-degree hot spring? Because once you're living in a 160-degree hot spring, nothing can eat you. Nothing can gobble up the other organic compounds in your area. You've got that hot spring all to yourself. So there are huge evolutionary advantages to being able to tolerate environments that no other organisms can tolerate. But it's highly unlikely that life would have evolved in these places in the first place. So if there's some planet that has a surface temperature of 300 degrees, and has always had a surface temperature of 300 degrees, it's pretty unlikely that life would evolve in such a extremely hot environment. But if there was a planet that started out with a surface temperature of 120 degrees, and then over time the greenhouse effect heated it up like Venus to hundreds of degrees, we can imagine if life got started while that planet was a little more friendly to organic compounds, that life could have figured out a way to hang around and adapt slowly to that changing environment. Okay, so I'll go ahead and leave that there for today. Just keep in mind that, remember, when we talk about life as we know it, we have to be careful not to rule out life as we do not know it. And we've only got one planet so far where we know what life is like and what it can tolerate. And it can tolerate a pretty wide range of conditions. So we should be maybe optimistic that life that evolved on some other planets can withstand an equally wide range of conditions, maybe even wider than we're able to easily conceive of as Earth inhabitants who are used to Earth-like conditions. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop that there, and then we'll talk about, we've got sort of 2 more days to talk about questions of extraterrestrial life. So we'll wrap up that topic this week.